Thank you so much. Thank you to Palante, thank you to Jakari, thank you to Daniel. And here is, oh, you're going to take care of that. Great. So you are going to be getting an enormous amount of information, and I don't want you to be stressing out about taking a million notes. The bottom line is going to be a handful of key agencies and resources that you can go to for the things that are most relevant to you, because not everything will be relevant to you. We're covering a whole lot of information in the next half hour. If you do have a question, Jakari had mentioned you can put it in the, I think it was the Q&A you said? Yeah.
Yes,
But
the Q&A box.
but don't, also just bear in mind that it might be on the next slide, the thing you're asking. So it might get answered before we actually get to the end and the Q&A. So it used to be, because I've been working in housing for a very long time, it used to be that I would tell people, well, if you're not talking about San Francisco and Boston and New York City, LA, it's pretty affordable in this country. Well, it's becoming less and less affordable in most places. It's still true that if you were to relocate to Milwaukee or St. Louis or Louisville, or there's still a lot of places that are more affordable, but there's a terrible lack of affordable housing in the entire country. So unfortunately, the New York experience has now spread, but things are very, very bad, and it's not just you. So everyone's looking in the same main places, right? To look for a new apartment. StreetEasy, Craigslist, Trulia, Zillow. Listings Project is one you may not know. I want you to think about your own personal network, people who you go to the community garden with, people who you go to church with, people who work at your large, especially if you work at a large place of business like a university or a hospital or someplace big. That's a good way to learn about apartments that where the owner doesn't necessarily advertise the vacancy. And yes, anytime something's in short supply, there are going to be people who are going to try to scam you. So you do have to make sure, and we're going to talk about this a little later on, that you verify that you're talking to the legitimate broker, the legitimate owner of that property, and it's not someone who's pretending to control the rental of that property. Don't be scared to look at neighborhoods that you're not already familiar with. If you commute to your job, take a look at the train lines you commute on and be open to all the apartments, all the neighborhoods, not just the one that you're in now that you grew up in. Be open. A lot of times people have very strong attitudes of like I'm a Brooklyn person, I don't look in the Bronx, or I'm a Bronx person, I don't look in Brooklyn. Be open-minded. Go into, I'm a big fan of all of the filters that you can use in a lot of these big websites. You can put in the price range, you can put in whether they accept cats, whether they accept dogs, how many bedrooms you absolutely need, if it must have like a laundry facility on site, or if you can be flexible about that. The more flexible you can be, obviously, the better, but it allows you to put in the filters that are very important. For example, if you must have a ground floor apartment or a elevator, it allows you to filter for that. So it does allows you to filter for some important things. Some very, very large rental, let's say Grenadier Management Company, Wavecrest Management, there's a million very, very large ones. Phipps Houses, there's a lot of very large companies. They will often have advertise on their own websites. You have a friend, they're in a big building, it's a well-managed building. You might want to look at the management company and see if they advertise apartments on their own website. Brokers' fees still apply, I believe, until June, but we're going to get to that shortly. So we can move to the next slide. Again, be open, look in places that you're not all that familiar with. Generally, Manhattan and Brooklyn have been the most expensive places. So again, look at your commuting line and think about how you get there and be open to new neighborhoods. Jakari, we can go forward. So there are so many ways to know who legitimately owns a building. Department of Finance, the Department of Buildings, HPD. If a landlord has a tenant and it's not a tiny building and they don't live in the building, legally they're supposed to be registering with HPD. You can go to HPD online and you can look it up and see if it's currently registered. You can also go to the Department of Finance website and click on property tax bills, and you can see where is the property tax mailed. You can see the name of the guy and where the property tax gets mailed to. And you can also see Department of Finance. You can go look at the mortgage. You can look at the deed of sale, and you can see who owns the building. It's can be very difficult because it can be some sort of a like 123 Main Street LLC, which is opaque, and you don't know who actually owns it. But if you do a little looking around on these websites, HPD particularly, and finance, you are usually able to find out, especially if it is properly registered, in which case a management contact and an owner contact will be visible on the HPD website. Very important. So this don't use cash. Again, there is always the chance that somebody sketchy is advertising an apartment and wants you to pay up front to confirm, to put a down payment down on the apartment, security deposit. Don't use cash, don't use cash, don't use cash, because you have to do all this research. They're going to rush you, and you want to be very careful ahead of time that you're actually dealing with the owner, because these things do come up. 2019, huge change on a state level. There had been a lot of rules specifically for rent stabilized apartments that had been tilted aggressively toward the benefit of the landlord, and it made it easier to pull apartments out of rent stabilization. A lot of those rules tipped back in favor of tenants in 2019, and we're going to talk about some of these issues in specific, but as a general rule, things moved back more favorably for tenants, especially in rent stabilized apartments in 2019. And you can read about those on the internet, specifically on the Attorney General's page. Next slide, please. So, big issues all the time having to do with the legality of an apartment. Technically, a cellar, which is a level of a building that is 51% below grade, below the ground level, is legally never supposed to be slept in. And a basement, it depends. If it's that would be on the Department of Buildings website. It would tell you whether the basement apartment is a legal apartment. There is a difference between legality and safety. There are apartments that you, because it's a good deal, might make a decision on your own to live in, even if it isn't legal, because you determine that there are egresses, it has the proper fire protection from the boiler, there's proper, there's sprinklers, or the windows are large enough to get out of, because a lot of people make decisions, there aren't enough affordable apartments in the city. I could never tell you as a government employee to live anywhere that's illegal. But the most important thing to bear in mind is whether something is safe. Let's say you go to an apartment. This was an example that I pulled once from government records. This was an apartment. Arbitrarily, it was a building in 359 Hendricks. This was on the HPD website. The point was, you'll note it says 4 stories, 54 A units. An A unit is an apartment, meaning it has a kitchen and a bathroom within the walls of the dwelling unit. A B unit is what people generally think of as SROs, where you might have a shared kitchen and or a shared bath. If you look at the mailboxes at an address and you don't see 54, you see 55, you see 56, you have to start questioning whether there are units in the building that have been illegally either subdivided or created from a cellar or a basement that were never approved by the Department of Buildings. The risk you take beyond the safety is that if someone calls the Department of Buildings or HPD and they see there are 55 or 56 units, especially if they look in a basement unit, the city might force you to leave the apartment, and the city might even would also make the landlord rip out the probably the kitchen or the bathroom. So you're also putting yourself at risk because a neighbor could call the city, or so a neighbor you're having a dispute with, or somebody. So you do want to do your homework. If there's any question in your mind about whether the apartment is legal, you want to check it out on Department of Buildings, HPD, and the Department of Finance website. Next slide, please. Okay, finances, right? Because we've all heard about housing discrimination, where you can't discriminate against people, race, color, religion, because they have children, source of income, meaning whether you're using a housing voucher or you're not using a housing voucher. Those are all technically illegal. What is not illegal is that landlords have a lot of people who want those apartments, and they often are looking for 40 times of the rent and income, which makes it very hard for people with low incomes to compete for apartments. Bear in mind, there are free programs the city has through the Department of Consumer Affairs Office of Financial Empowerment. There are free programs to help you build up that credit score. And so definitely think about that. If you don't have a credit score, if you have a poor credit score, there are opportunities beyond Department of Consumer Affairs, but Consumer Affairs is one way to do it. You can get a free credit score. You can check your credit report without paying for it. So that's a good thing to be aware of. And you may, the reality is in this current market, you may end up having to have a roommate, which, many people don't want, but it may be the only way that you're going to get a landlord to qualify you for that apartment. If there are 2 or even 3 incomes coming in that provide enough income for them to feel that you are a reliable choice. Some people don't know that there's a thing called co-signers and guarantors. So that's something that you might want to become familiar with if your income is too low to keep the landlord comfortable. Next slide, please. So here are details. They're not exactly the same thing, but it's basically someone who says, like, I have trust in you, I will back you up if something happens, if you get sick, if you're between jobs, if something happens, they're willing to take on the legal liability of paying the rent. It has to be someone who has significant income, because the landlord has to be able to see that the person can pay their own housing expenses plus pay yours if something happens. If you have no one in your life who can do that, you can learn more about there are companies that provide guarantor services. You can look into them. This one is just a sample, this mentioned here of Insurent.com, but there are companies that provide rental guarantees to people who do not have high enough income. You can explore more about that. Next slide, please. So, rent stabilized apartments, you probably heard about them. These are leases for particular units that are registered with New York State HCR, Homes and Community Renewal. Generally, they're in large buildings. It used to be what we would say it was in old buildings that are large, but when a building is developed in the last, let's say, decade, using any government subsidy, the owner got a J51, the owner got a 421A, they got a tax exemption, they got a tax abatement, they got a loan. The developer got any benefit from the taxpayer, then they signed an agreement that certain units for certain periods of time, usually many decades, would have to be in the rent stabilization system. That includes every apartment that goes through the rental lottery, which we'll talk about in a minute. But so the terms of the original lease you sign for a rent stabilized apartment are very powerful. And for example, bad conditions in an apartment. Anyone can go to housing court and learn about taking a landlord to court for bad conditions. But if you're rent stabilized, you can also talk to the Rent Stabilization Agency, New York State HCR, about the conditions that were promised to you to be maintained as a result of you having a rent stabilized lease. So you're in a stronger position as a tenant if you happen to have a rent stabilized lease. Let's talk about the lottery for a second. New York, you may be familiar with Housing Connect, but that is the way that the HDC, HPD distributes new apartments, newly constructed apartments, and also some re-rentals. You can find them there. It is free to participate in Housing Connect. It is, the whole process is free, but it's a lottery. There are certain benefits depending on what neighborhood you live in, and if you're in a certain disability categories, such as a movement disability or a visual impairment, hearing impairment. There are still preferences for certain community boards. They will be phasing out over the next few years, but at the moment there are still these preferences. Definitely take a look at it. If you can wait, no apartment that you get through the lottery will cost more than about 33% of your income. They're rent stabilized, which means the rent will go up based on the housing guidelines, the rent stabilization guidelines, and they will no longer going forward be pegged to your income. But it will, when you first sign the lease, you're guaranteed that it's going to be an affordable apartment for the household income when you sign the lease. It is good to look at the New York City HDC website occasionally, because there are some additional resources there, but most everything is on the HPD Housing Connect portal. Next slide, please. So let's say you do have a rent stabilized lease. These are the phone numbers and the locations of where you can go to ask any questions about stuff that's going on in your apartment, stuff that's going on in the building, with the management company, with the owner, and they can help you enforce the terms of your rent stabilized lease. So as you see, Manhattan has 2 offices. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a lot. A very useful resource is the New York City Housing Portal. I haven't looked at it lately, so I don't know if it's being kept up to date, but it's a very rich resource to find all sorts of things related to housing in New York City, because it's complicated. A lot of neighborhoods we found over the last 10 years, there were crazy floods in neighborhoods that nobody thought got flooded. Parts of the Bronx, parts of Queens, Brooklyn, neighborhoods where there weren't coastal, but still were flooded. If you're not sure, you can go on the web and look up and see what are the low-lying areas, and you may want to be careful about any basement apartment in those neighborhoods. We discussed the categories, the classes of people who cannot, where you cannot legally discriminate. That is controlled and enforced by the New York City CCHR, Commission on Human Rights. And if you are convinced that you are not getting an apartment because you're in a protected class because of your source of income being a voucher, because you have children, because of your race, your religion, your sexual orientation, your gender expression, all those things are protected in New York City, and you can talk to New York City HCR. Renters insurance, worth thinking about. Things happen all the time. There are floods, there's burglary, there's fires. Read the fine print, but take a look. It may be right for you. I talked about the filters before. We're going to talk about home buying here. One of the filters you can put into something like Trulia Zillow is you can put in a keyword. And one of the keywords could be, you can choose to put in, for example, an HDFC. There are a lot of very affordable, low-priced co-ops that can be purchased. And one way to find them is looking on the UHEB website. One way to find them is by doing a search, again, on something like Trulia and typing in the word HDFC. And those apartments will have, we'll say, we're accepting people who have an income of minimum X, maximum Y, certain number of people to qualify for a certain number of bedrooms, and they're a very affordable option. So you might want to consider those co-ops, which were subsidized and converted from apartment buildings to co-ops, but with government, meaning taxpayer money, and therefore you can find them at very reasonable prices. Home First. There are first-time home buyer subsidies, grants, free money for qualifying tenants who want to become homeowners, condos, co-ops, houses. On the city level, there's Home First. You find it on the HPD website. For anything in New York State, you can look at the rules for SONIMA. That's the State of New York Mortgage Agency. And there's also NACA, which is a national program. Let's say you want to relocate somewhere else. Go to the NACA website and find out about their program to help you become a first-time home buyer anywhere in the country. Home First is only for New York City. SONIMA is only for New York State. Yeah, the rules, I don't know. Everything has to have a caveat right now because of what's going on with the federal government. Traditionally, every spring, the federal government would issue the new AMIs, which was a determination of the maximum amount of income a family of a certain size could have and qualify for to get one of these first homebuyer assistance grants. The last time I looked, the maximum was approximately $124,000 for a four-person household, but definitely worth thinking about because for many people, they have a pretty decent salary and they're paying quite a bit of rent, but the challenge is that they don't have the asset. They don't have the down payment. So this is a way to get you over that hurdle and get you into home buying. And if you stay in the co-op, the condo, the house for more than X years, I think it could be 20, it could be 10, the loan becomes a grant. And it effectively was just a grant for you to get into that unit. So if you have any interest in that, if you think your family income is sufficient, take a look because you are required to take a short course, at least with Home First. The courses are offered online and all over the city at different agencies. And you do have to deal with the time involved to work with HPD to get the loan processed. But ultimately, it's really a lot of money and it's worth looking into. So I highly recommend that. Okay, next slide. So there used to be this first month, last month, where effectively you had to pay 3 months right up front to move into an apartment. That was changed in 2019. So it's now 1 month rent for rent stabilized tenants. If the landlord in a non-rent stabilized apartment is demanding more than 1 month's rent, here's my first reference to Housing Court Answers, an agency I refer to constantly. You can walk into any housing court or you can call Housing Court Answers, and they will, unless Jakari happens to know, they will let you know whether in a non-rent stabilized apartment, the landlord is allowed to ask you for more than a security deposit, one security deposit. Next slide. So how much notice you get before a rent increase, and depends on how long you've been in the apartment. So the longer you're in the apartment, the more notice a landlord is legally required to give you. And again, you don't have to remember this. You can always look this up on the Attorney General's website, or you can just Google it. But they can't just suddenly spring the rent increase on you, and give you 2 weeks. Again, if you're in a rent stabilized apartment, this was always true, that they had to give you an official amount of time before giving you your lease renewal. But this is now applies also to people who live in market rate, non-regulated apartments. Next slide. Okay, the broker fee. So people heard all about this last year, but it didn't take effect until this June, right? So if the landlord had hired the broker, the tenant is not obliged to pay a broker fee. You may choose to hire a broker. You may notice that you're looking for apartments in a particular neighborhood, and you keep seeing the same broker being affiliated with those apartments. And you say, hey, I really want to tell this broker, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Give me a call when you find it, right? Maybe you want to hire a broker, they provide a service to you, but before there would be a broker fee because the landlord hired the broker and you had no say in the matter. That is not true as of June 11th. So then application fees, the application fee is capped at $20. That's different from whether there is or isn't a broker fee, and that should cover the cost of any credit check or background check that is done for a landlord. There may be times when you can reuse a credit check within a certain period of time, so it doesn't have to be pulled repeatedly. But I do not remember the details. This will not apply with condos and co-ops. Often people in condos and co-ops rent out their owned unit. There may be all kinds of extra fees that a co-op or a condo can charge, and that would be separate from the new law about brokers or the $20 cap for an application fee. That would only be for rentals in non-condos, non-co-ops. Okie doke. Next slide, please. So you may have heard in the last week or so that the Rent Guidelines Board has made recommendations of a range of potential new 1 and 2 year leases. It was not, I believe, voted on yet. So we're still operating under the current rules, which are leases that begin before September 30th of this year. And these are the increases that a rent stabilized apartment can get. We're waiting to hear what they will be for the 25, 26 period. You can always keep abreast of it by looking at the Rent Guidelines Board website. Next slide. Sounds obvious, but check out if it's a neighbor, if you're not really used to a neighborhood, if you don't really know a building and you think you like it, go, if someone showed you the apartment on a sunny, Tuesday morning, check it out at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. Check out the block. Maybe, talk to people in the lobby or in front of the building and say, I'm thinking about renting here. What's the deal, right? Maybe they can warn you or encourage you, but it's good to know because there may be information about that particular block or that building that no broker is going to tell you and no landlord's going to tell you. So get friendly, and I'm sure you can find people who can talk to you. Again, if you've looked for an apartment before, you'll know this, but it is very competitive. So you definitely do want to have your verification of income, recent income ready, have bank information ready, have ID information ready, so that really, if you do stumble on an apartment that you know is good for you, they're not going to want to wait for you to spend a lot of time gathering your documents. So definitely have that stuff together when you start looking at the apartments. Okay, next slide. So this is a lot, but there are asset limits to affordable housing. And this is something that you are going to have to bear in mind because if you do get picked for a lottery apartment, they're going to ask you for a lot of information. And it's possible that your assets will be too high to qualify for an apartment. So bear this in mind. There are rental asset limits, and there are ownership, because occasionally through the housing lottery, there will be condos and co-ops. It's not all the time, but it's sometimes. And those will have a different asset limit. But do bear that in mind, that their asset limits apply, not just income limits. Next slide. So I went through this with you before, which is that when the home first down payment, it is an evaporating loan. So after you live there long enough, it goes from being a loan to being a grant. And I went on the website in the last couple of weeks, and I did not see any new information for 2025. But this gives you an example that a one-person household, the maximum income to qualify was $79,200. A two-person household, $90,500, for example. Definitely worth looking at, because often the carrying costs will be similar to what you're paying in rent. Next slide. So, good cause eviction. This got a lot of coverage last year. Part of this had to do with extending kind of some of the laws that already applied to people who had rent stayed or lived in NYCHA to people who live in market rate apartments. One of the main issues about qualifying for good cause eviction is it doesn't apply if your landlord has 10 or fewer units of housing. So you live in a 3-family home, good cause eviction protections don't apply to you. But many people have learned that you don't know, you might not know. Let's say you live in a 6-unit apartment building. You don't know what else the landlord owns. Well, fortunately, who owns what? Just Fix is a nonprofit, and you can find, I think, Jakar, if you hover over that word here, it may or may not come up. Yeah, see, that's who owns what justfix.nyc. There's a very clever website that actually has, I don't even know how they did it. You are able to see what other buildings your landlord owns. Probably using ACRIS connected to their, whether they've actually got documents of ownership on ACRIS. Zukari, please, chime in if you know how exactly that works, because I don't know, but it's very clever, because you can say, oh, my building only has 6 units, and check there and realize, oh, wait, my landlord owns 4 buildings and it totals 32 units. And therefore I do have good cause eviction protections that I wouldn't have thought I have. So that's a very helpful resource. There's a complicated formula which has to do with the amount of the increase proposed for your apartment and I'm trying to look for what the word is, and it also takes into account inflation. But once the landlord is offering you again, if you're rent stable or you're in NYCHA, this isn't relevant because that's controlled then by someone else. But if you're in a fair market apartment and the rent is going up over 5%, you're going to have to look at what the formula is. The current formula came out to 8.79, which is a combination of inflation and I guess plus the 5%. But if it's a high, if it's, let's say that your landlord is saying, I want a 9, 10, 15, 20% increase, you actually might be able to take them to court and say that this is an illegally high increase. It's a little complicated. You'll say it's more than the reasonable rent standard. If it's a high increase, it's worth, again, calling Housing Court Answers for free advice on whether the amount that the increase is enough for you to actually challenge it in housing court. But the premise of good cause eviction was to give you a basis to challenge that rent increase. There are exceptions, and I believe it's on the next page. If you're a terrible tenant, it's not that you can no longer be evicted. You can be evicted, but they can't just give you a very high rent increase without being at risk of now you going to housing court. So here's a short list of some of the things that you can't do in an apartment that could put you at risk of being legitimately evicted, and that can absolutely be true. Your landlord also must, in leases starting, I guess, last year, they're now supposed to be proactively telling you that your apartment does or does not qualify for good cause eviction. So they should be admitting to you in the lease with some sort of lease rider that tells you that the apartment, that they own more than that small building and your apartment does qualify. But so they can also get in trouble now if you go to housing court and you can say, turns out I am covered by good cause eviction and they didn't include this rider in my lease. That's another thing you can ask at housing court answers. But again, this good cause eviction did take effect last August. Okay, next one. There we go. So thank you very much for your attention. I know that was a lot.
No, thank you, Pamela. But can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of questions that came in. The same question has came up. A lot of people want to know about the slides and if they are able to get the slides that you presented on. I'm not sure if we
Yes.
are able to share those.
As far as I'm concerned, yes. Yes.
Okay, so for those who asked that question, I will send out the slides tomorrow to you. So starting with the first question, which is when you speak of guarantor is income, are assets taken into consideration such as stocks, 401k, bonds, and what if the guarantor is out of state?
I don't know. I think they just I think they just have to show that they're financially able to cover both their own housing costs and your housing costs. But I do not know the details, and you should definitely you should definitely, I either call Housing Court Answers, or there may be something on like the Attorney General's website. Find some, something that seems like a
Okay.
safe, legitimate description of what a guarantor must have.
Okay. Next question says, what to do if you are being discriminated against and the landlord wants to evict you? Um, for that, I would just say you can call Palante, um, so we can assist you with that situation. Our number is 212-491-2541. You could give us a call tomorrow to further discuss that. The next question, I'm single and will become a senior soon and am interested in affordable housing. After speaking with a housing ambassador, and Pam, you can see the questions too. Okay. Ambassador, I was told my 401k retirement would disqualify me from any affordable housing. HPD in the past took a percentage of the sum rather than the complete 401k sum. What kinds of senior affordable housing would I qualify for?
Okay, so if it's a question about our lottery rules, and that would include any asset, I would call 212-863-7990, which is the HPD Lottery Department, and ask them to clarify. It does sound like you know that you do not qualify. We don't produce a lot of affordable, specifically senior housing, although we do create some. You could also look at Mitchell Lama re-rentals. I don't know what their requirements are, but you could certainly look at New York State Mitchell Lama re-rentals and New York City Mitchell Lama re-rentals. You can find that also through our website, through Housing Connect. It says something about Mitchell Lama re-rentals, but I don't know in New York City if there's a way to get around that asset limit for what we call governmentally subsidized affordable housing.
We just got a question to repeat the number. I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Yeah, the 7990 number is the lottery number. Yeah.
But can you repeat it in full one more
Of
time?
course, 212-863-7990.
Okay, so that number now is in the chat for everyone to see. What does HPD Section 8 vouchers open up to apply? I guess I mean when is it open?
Yeah, so basically it's been so long, I don't have an answer. I believe it was last summer for a few weeks. NYCHA suddenly opened their Section 8 waiting list. It's closed again. We're also in a bind because I believe that, again, the federal government has told us that the amount of money that we were looking for to continue a certain batch of the HPD Section 8 vouchers is being threatened. All Section 8 funding is potentially at risk. So I have nothing positive to say about an opportunity to get a Section 8 voucher. It's possible that, again, going forward, NYCHA will once again open up, but HPD doesn't do it with any pattern that I've ever seen.
Okay.
Oh, but let me add something. If you're at risk of homelessness, if you are in a housing crisis, you've lost your job, you got sick, you got behind in your rent, but in the long run, you think you can afford your apartment, or you're truly at risk of you're being homeless, you're going to call 311 and ask for the home base that's associated with your zip code, and you can just Google NYC home base locations. There are many across the city. They're affiliated with groups of zip codes. And they're the people who, by working with New York City HRA, the Social Service Agency, they allocate other vouchers. They allocate HASA, FEPS, City FEPS, SOTA vouchers. So if you are in a housing crisis, call 311 and have them connect you to the home base that's affiliated with your zip code.
Okay. The next question, how can you report illegal basement apartments?
311.
So I have two questions that came in. One was an email and one is from a listener that's calling from the phone. The first one is, do you recommend subletting for tenants?
Well, subletting is controlled, if it's a rent stabilized apartment, exactly how and when you can sublet, you have to follow the rules of New York State HCR, or you're at risk of losing your own lease. But you can, if you follow those rules, you're protecting your own lease. It's, if you're not in a rent regulated apartment, I don't know the rules, so I would ask Housing Court Answers if there's some sort of a boilerplate that you would maybe have, that you would sign with the subletter to make sure that everything is covered and you're clear on each other's responsibilities.
Okay. The next one that was emailed was, what is the process of transferring out of a Section 8 apartment due to my disability? And the apartment is not accessible. Yeah.
Yeah, if you, well, you can always contact whoever issued your voucher, whether it's HPD or NYCHUP, and get a move voucher and find an accessible apartment. That being said, if it's feasible for the landlord, not every apartment can be made accessible, but if it's feasible for the landlord to modify, let's say a couple steps into the lobby, and then there's an elevator, or if it's feasible potentially to make your apartment accessible, New York City Commission on Human Rights, they work with you and your landlord to try to make your apartment accessible. But if it's not possible, if you're in a walk-up, let's say, and you're suddenly not able to do that, you just contact whoever issued your Section 8 voucher and you can get a move voucher. You can also call for assistance. One way to get assistance is perhaps to try CIDNY, Center for Independence for the Disabled in New York City. And I wonder if they could help you with the process of moving into a suitable apartment.
Mm-hmm. One question came in, is it any specific program for someone who has cancer and can get extra help for someone?
Is this about getting help into the
I guess
apartment or paying the rent?
apartment. I'm assuming like apartment for someone who has cancer, like a program dedicated to that for with
I would
illness.
ask a social worker in the hospital where you're getting treated, if they know of anything, and I would call CIDNY or the American Cancer. No, don't call American Cancer Association. Call CIDNY to see if they know anything about that.
So we haven't had any more questions coming as of yet. But I wanted to ask you, Pamela, because at my office we use HPD online a lot to see like the violations that the landlords have and if the work is being completed. And do you recommend that as well, like for people looking at apartments to go on HPD online
That's
before they
an
rent?
excellent idea, because you can look up the address, you can see the number of complaints, you can see the number of violations, the number of open violations in the past 2 years. That's what's public. If you see that it's, sometimes you'll see a lot of violations and it's all one apartment, there may be a story there. You may see if it's all over the building and there's lots of C and D, which are the more serious, dangerous kinds of violations, and they're open, which means the landlord either didn't do the work or didn't bother to clear them. You don't know which. It's a useful thing to check, but it's also complicated because I've heard stories that let's say there are buildings that have a significant percentage of undocumented tenants. They may have bad conditions and they don't report them. You may also have a building that has someone who is impossible and is just having at war with the landlord, and the rest of the tenants are fine with the landlord. So you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But if you're seeing loads of violations that are open and they're old, they're more than a couple months old, you have to worry that this is a management company that isn't paying attention.
Exactly. We have a question. It says, landlord is trying to evict me, lying on the case saying I owe 45,000 in rent. Can you repeat the information about the new eviction laws that took place last August?
Well, if I would like to believe that this tenant has some documentation to show that they paid the rent, right? Either, bank statements or money orders or whatever it is, to show that they paid the rent, because never pay cash, or get a receipt. You always want a receipt. However you're paying your rent, you want a receipt because you don't want a landlord to pretend. You also have landlords who will stop taking your money because they want you out. They won't cash any of your rent checks. Call housing court answers. In theory, depending on how backed up they are, they might even be able to connect you with an attorney. I won't promise you that because it's hard to get an attorney. But go to housing court and call housing court answers, or go into housing court in your borough and see how they advise you if you can fight this. If the landlord's lying, you should be able to find a way to fight it.
Mhm. They just responded, yes, we have evidence of rent paid and up to date on rent. Yeah.
So definitely go to housing court because
Mhm.
landlord, I don't know what the landlord's problem is.
Right. And like I said before, that attendee, please call my office if you have time. And then the leak, okay, next question. I have a leak in my apartment from Sunday. Is there any way to get an expedited HPD inspection?
So
Blocked. Well,
you have to definitely call 311. But once you call 311 and let's say it's 24 hours later, then you can look up the code enforcement office, which is on Old Broadway. You can just look up the New York City Code Enforcement Office. And you can then, once you know that the 311 has been transferred from 311 to HPD, which usually takes at least 12 hours and maybe 24, then you can call the office and see if you can actually get them to schedule an inspection ASAP, especially if it's like a leak. You have to have called 311.